So good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Jim Ottaviani back to our At Home with Literati series in conversation this evening with Bill Fink. First, a quick overview of our webinars. The chat is closed, but you may want to keep the chat window open during the event. I will be dropping links to purchase Naturalist from Literati. And if you're watching later on YouTube, there will be links in the description below. You can submit questions for the Q&A using the Q&A feature available to you at any time, and I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation. As a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com. Thousands of titles are available for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our events, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for joining us this evening or this afternoon or this morning, depending on where in the world and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I'll introduce our author and moderator this evening. Jim Ottaviani has written a dozen graphic novels about scientists. His most recent books are Hawking, The Imitation Game, a biography of Alan Turing, Primates about Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and Feynman, a book about the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, bongo playing artist, and raconteur Richard Feynman. His books are New York Times bestsellers, have been translated into over a dozen languages, and have received praise from publications ranging from Nature and Physics World to Entertainment Weekly and Variety. Jim lives in Michigan and comes to comics via careers in nuclear engineering and librarianship. And Dr. Bill Fink has received his PhD from George Washington University in 1976. His dissertation on deep sea stomaform fishes was directed by Dr. Stanley Weitzman of the Smithsonian Institution. He then joined the faculty of Harvard University, where he was also curator of fishes in the Museum of Comparative Zoology. At the University of Michigan, he was a professor of biology and curator of fishes in the Museum of Zoology and director of the Museum of Zoology. Dr. Fink is a past president of the Society of Systematic Biologists, former editor of Copia, founding fellow of the Henning Society, and was awarded the LSNA Excellence in Education Award in 1999. He retired in 2014. They can't hear you, but they can sense it through the great power of the internet. So please join me in welcoming Jim Ottaviani and Dr. Bill Fink to your living rooms.
Thanks, John.
Glad to be here.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, Jim. I understand you wrote a book. Graphic novel.
Yeah, recently one just came out. So
Well,
yeah.
I believe it's called The Naturalist.
Also true. And yeah, now that we're saying this, and I have to admit that, did I write the book? Or did I, capital W or small w write the book?
Well, we're going to get to that.
Okay, let's get to that.
So actually, the first question I want to ask you, and probably you've been asked this before, is why the autobiography of E.O. Wilson called The Naturalist, so he wrote it.
Yep.
Why now? Why a graphic novel? Ed's 91 now. The book is 20 years old.
Yep.
So who decided this is a good time and this is a good person?
Well, I sure didn't decide. I don't have anywhere near the chutzpah or the audacity or whatever you want to call it to approach the publisher and say, this classic memoir should be done in comics. They approached me. And I think the reason for now is in part because the book had maybe shifted into that sort of classic mode. And there are people who are always looking for the new, the most recent, the freshest sort of take on a topic and won't look at classics. Similarly, there are people out there, you and I aren't among them because we're ambidextrous, we read comics and prose, but folks who will, see The Naturalist and reaching over here, the original book and say, oh man, that is a lot of text. and be intimidated by it. And for all its, one of comics's virtues, I think, is that it feels less intimidating to people, in part because it's got this sort of disreputable past and reputation for being, lowbrow entertainment. And in part, I think, because people really do find it easy, fun, interesting to engage with images in sequence, in engaging with pictures. And so the publisher, Island Press, through their editor, Rebecca Bright, contacted me and said, hey, I think it's a good time for us to bring Naturalist to possibly a new generation and a new audience. And Professor Wilson, sometimes I'll call him Professor Wilson, sometimes I'll call him Ed. I have a hard time deciding what's right. You knew him as Ed. He's interested in seeing a new edition of this and was good with the idea that comics might be a way to bring this thing back out in a fresh way.
So somebody at the press was a fan of the book. And
Well,
man,
I think they are the current publisher. It's been through a bunch of publishers over the years, as is often the case with a classic. It comes out from one place, they sell a bunch. I don't know. Maybe Ed thought he could get a better deal somewhere else, or maybe the publisher said, "All right, we've sold as much as we're going to do on this thing. We'll move on." But anyway, they hold the rights to the prose version right now, and thought comics would be a good idea too.
well, as I was going through the graphic novel, I was again impressed by how much the man did. I mean, it's just amazing. And I'm just going to read off a few things here so I don't forget. But he was involved early on in concepts of species and subspecies, which have been traditional problems for biologists for centuries. Character displacement, which means when two closely related organisms occupy the same general geographic area, their characteristics tend to diverge so that they don't overlap one another. Island biogeography, which you do a beautiful job in the novel describing. I was actually an undergraduate in South Florida when he was doing that work, and he came to give us a seminar in our biology program. And he was out killing all the organisms on these clumps of trees. It was just amazing.
It's less nefarious than it sounds, by the way, for folks listening in. These are fairly small mangrove islands, so it's not like he's like going to the Hispaniola and trying to wipe everything out.
Right. He would have liked to have been able to, but he couldn't do that. But yeah, they did mangrove things, and
there are actually some bits in the book. Sorry to interrupt, but where he alludes to wanting to go bigger, and these are aspects where we might have played up the exaggeration that you can do in comics a little bit more. Having his wife Renee react in horror, it's like, Ed, you are not going to wipe out everything on Madagascar or what? Yeah.
But the graphic novel shows you in such a nice way exactly what he was doing and what kinds of problems he had, and you just can't get that out of text. You just can't do it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
And of course, he was also one of the major movers in the move of evolutionary biology into human biology, sociobiology, which now is fractured into things like evolutionary psychology. And we can come back to that if you'd like to.
Well, if we do, I'll be interrogating you because you know much more about it than I do.
Well, we'll see. And of course, he's written philosophical books, and most recently he's gotten very deeply involved in philosophy and reality of biodiversity.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, his notion of biophilia,
right,
really quite interesting.
and he came across a couple of Pulitzer Prizes along the way. So it's clear why he's an important person that might be worth, running by the folks again,
Yeah.
showing a new generation and maybe an old generation something new about him. And I thought the graphic novel did a wonderful job of that. One thing that it also did was show how generous the man is by, sorry, I've got a throat thing going on here. The neighbors are burning leaves and it's
Oh
bad.
dear.
He was very generous in giving credit to all the people that he worked with. And you look at the people that he name dropped throughout the book, and almost every person that he interacted with, I recognize those names. They were important players in ecology and evolutionary biology in the last century.
Mhm.
Some of them invented fields through his interactions with them. And he was also generous in mentioning the people that he disagreed with. And I thought that was a really good way to illustrate who the man was. And I guess one question I'd like to ask you is,
Mhm.
on this journey of turning this autobiography into a graphic novel, how did that affect your personal view of the man, and especially his ideas, and most especially about his ideas about biodiversity and human evolution and our future?
Yeah. I'll have to confess that when Rebecca contacted me, I don't think I had read anything but smattering bits and pieces in basically the popular press by or about him. So he was another one of these figures. Figures sounds really weird to me all of a sudden. He's another one of these people who, at least to my level of understanding, was kind of famous for being famous.
Mhm.
But I didn't really know anything. I would put actually Jane Goodall, who I did a book targeted at younger readers for, in the same category. It's like, yeah, Jane Goodall, chimps. So yeah, she studied chimps, and now everybody loves her because she's really kind. But I didn't know any detail about her research. And I would say the same thing was true about Professor Wilson. I knew he had studied and focused largely on ants, especially in, at least for the bulk of his career. And I know he'd gotten into some hot water for his ideas about human evolution and sociobiology, which turned into a dirty word for a period of time. But that's really all I knew. I didn't know anything more than just these really tiny snippets. So the opportunity, one of the greatest things about getting to do what I get to do is to make a book, you get to learn a lot of stuff. And so I got to learn a lot of things about his work and his life. As you said, it spans a big chunk of, modern biological science history. And it was actually just really quite enjoyable to do. One of the bigger challenges was that Rebecca asked me not to depart too much from the text itself. So, take naturalist prose, adapt that, don't bring in work from lots of other things he did. We want this to be a version of the original book, not some sort of synthesis, if you will, of a lot of things. I cheated. I had to, I wanted to read other things. I wanted to hear his voice. Didn't have the opportunity to quiz him about every single bit whenever we were on the phone. So, listen to and watched interviews. And one of the reasons to do that was just to learn more, as we were saying. The other is, for the purpose of a graphic novel, you're going to have text that is caption text. Often that is used to express a character's inner thoughts and inner musings. But then you're going to have people saying stuff to each other. And the way you would write what dialogue for a prose book, and the way, especially, he's a fairly formal writer in many ways. That didn't seem like it was going to be a good match for the medium of comics. So I did feel justified in going out and listening to interviews and hearing him, speak otherwise, to sort of get the conversational tone. Again, the way you and I might write a scientific paper, no, you, not me really, is very different than the way we would talk. Even, I would guess, you would talk among your colleagues about science, say at a conference or things.
Yeah.
There's a very different style. And we wanted to bring the conversational, I keep gesturing at this thing that's nobody can see. We wanted to bring the conversational sort of feel into, the word balloons in the comics. So I feel like I might have strayed away from your one of your questions there by going into, say, the nitty gritty of what we did.
We'll get to some more nitty gritty, but I think that you did capture pretty well the conservative little C Southern gentleman that Ed is. He grew up in the Deep South in Mississippi, Alabama, places that I actually have spent some time. And
I was going to say, this is not foreign to you.
No, it's not foreign to me. And these are some of the most, well, except for Boston, it's some of the most provincial places I've ever lived. And it is kind of bubble-like. You don't really get much of the world down there. And the fact that he was able to retain the gentility of that era and time and place, and also become a really hard-nosed, very creative scientist, I think you managed to capture pretty well.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
So let me ask you a technical question, and that is, you had an entire autobiography that is all text that you had to condense down into a bunch of pictures.
Right.
So how do you do that? I mean, I actually went through the text of the book with the novel, with your book, and side by side, and I go, oh yeah, good choice. Or, oh damn, it's too bad he had to leave that out.
Yeah, yep.
So how do you make the choice? How do you do it?
I guess it starts with the obvious in the sense that you have to find things that lend themselves to a visual presentation. Because this is going to be a book full of pictures, 200 some pages, roughly 5-6 panels per page. That's 1,000 some images. I actually did the math, so we can go there.
Well,
if you want
could you
to
show me that cover again?
Yeah.
Let me just see that cover. Oh yeah, that's yeah, great. I think people needed to see that.
Okay. So you start by looking at what's visual. You continue on with things that can either complement those visuals or contradict them to layer additional information. That's one of the really nice things about comics. And people who have heard me talk about comics before have probably heard me say this before. But the amount of information that you can layer into an individual panel is much greater than people assume it is. So as a very simple example, you can use the text, the words that are there to reinforce the image, expand on the image, or sometimes contradict the image. And there are any number of those instances with his very, very patient mother during his youth, where she says one thing, one encouraging thing to Ed, young Ed, and her body language is pretty clearly, it's like, get that snake out of my house right now. And those are things that you look for in the text. And then, as I went through this, and this is the first time I've ever actually adapted a book, and it was really fun, and it was an interesting challenge. But then you're also looking for like the major themes. So you have to get biophilia in, you have to get the island biogeography in, there are things that have to be there. That's true of any story that you're going to tell. If we were going to do a book about your life and your work, there are certain things that you would say, this has got to be there. You can't leave that out. And so, back and forth, underlining, ignoring certain passages because they were just too abstract and couldn't come up with an interesting way to present them in the space available. And then working back and forth with Rebecca, the editor, and through Rebecca, Ed himself. And there were not too many instances where he said, no, you've totally missed a point here. The X has got to be there. And so figured out a way to get X or whatever it was into the book. But one of the really nice things about this process for me was they were both extremely generous in their willingness to trust myself and Chris Butzer, the artist, on what's going to work, what's not going to work. And I think they were both able to step back and just realize this is going to be a slightly different thing than the prose book. And that's fine. There's this great quote that I love from Raymond Chandler, who wrote a bunch of mystery novels that are excellent, still hold up, I think in the 30s and 40s, right? And a bunch of them got adapted into big major motion picture type things. And a friend comes over to Chandler's house at one point and says, Ray, man, can you believe what they're doing to your books? And Chandler goes, it's okay. The books are right there. It's fine. And to have someone like E.O. Wilson be willing to do that and say, the book I wrote is still the book I wrote. This is going to be a different thing for possibly a different audience, possibly a different generation, and be willing to let that sort of thing go was really a blessing. I must say that he isn't unique in that. Lots of the scientists, when I've worked with real live ones, as opposed to people who have been long dead, have done a similar thing. It's like, yeah, I understand this is a different sort of thing than my scientific paper or even my own writing about my life. So it's really great when people are willing to, let go a little and let the medium do what it's best at.
Did you give Ed any drafts to show him how this was going to work?
Yeah. So he saw and so I got the book from Rebecca. Actually, I went to the library and got a copy even before she sent me a copy to start marking up. I got the book, started marking things up, wrote an outline of what I thought this book would be. And, I think it's going to be about 200 and some pages. And I think this is how we're going to progress the story. And that was important because some of the things that I was going to do is I'm going to put this thing a little bit before this other thing. I'm going to shift the order occasionally in the book. And one of the things I also did was I didn't use Ed's ending. I stopped the book before he stopped the book, the original prose. I'm going to do certain things that went back and forth, got approved, up and down the line. And I assume the top of that food chain was Ed Wilson. Might not have been, but I'm guessing it was. And then wrote a full script which is the way I usually do, so it starts page 1, panel 1. This is what we're seeing. This is what people are saying. Page 1, panel 2. This is what we're seeing. This is what people are saying, all the way through to the end. Ed read that, I assume. Maybe not. Those are long. That's like 300 pages of text, at least, for a 200 and some page graphic novel, because there's lots of description of what you're seeing on the page. And then the script goes to Chris, the artist, who then does a fairly rough layout of the book, very sketchy drawings, just placing figures in space, not too much detail. Then all three of us, Ed, myself, and Rebecca, look that over, make sure that the storytelling is clear. Then it goes, and basically once we're all agreed on that, then it's completely Chris's show to finish with, professional looking, really nice ink drawings. As you saw, he really took great pains to make the natural world and, the flora and the fauna realistic and accurate. And layered on top of that, and this is the thing again that you're allowed to do in comics, had kind of cartoonier people, so that it's I can go into the theory of why that's the case. I think you and I have talked about this in book group before. But anyway, then Chris does the finished drawings. Then we go to color. Then we do one final pass on the words. Again with Ed's help, because sometimes you get to the drawing stage and it's like, we can cut words away. The picture has done the job. And then off we go.
Well, as you're talking about the layers of information that you can put into these graphic novels, I think about a couple things. One, and it threw me when I first started looking at the book, there's the 70-something-year-old Ed Wilson standing next to the 12-year-old Ed Wilson. And it took me a while to figure out, who's this old guy that's hanging around this kid?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But I figured that out pretty quickly. And then, as you say, the natural world is very much in abundance, and layered in the natural world is the scientific names of a significant part of that natural world.
Right.
So whose idea was that, and who had to do the legwork to match up the animals, plants, and names?
Okay, so this is where I'm very grateful that Chris lives in Hawaii and can't come over and punch me in the nose. So the idea for all of that nonsense was mine, I would say. Yeah, I think that's fair. And the legwork was largely Chris. Yeah, so he spent a lot of time, and so for the ants, at least, there's a site that he showed us called Antipedia, where you just drop in Latin name and it'll give you images and other characteristics. So that was great for the ants, but there's a lot more than just ants.
Yeah, lots more.
But the idea of, so let's work backwards from the natural world to the various Wilsons that appear in the story. This was the idea behind having the natural world be very rich, very lush, and populated not only by the things, but their scientific names and the implications of those scientific names, is going through Ed's own writing and knowing people like yourself. I think it's fair to say that you see the world a little differently from the rest of us when we're out walking in nature.
Yeah,
and
I find that happening when I go out in the field with a botanist, because I don't know anything about plants, and they have a much richer world than I do, because they know all about the plants.
Yeah,
their names.
And similarly, if someone was at a fishery, or on a boat
Big
in the Great
aquarium.
Lakes, you would know, you would be seeing stuff that I had no idea that subtle movement meant this in relation to this because of that.
Right.
So those scientific names are there, and you don't have to read them. They're just there to indicate, sort of as a visual clue that Wilson is seeing things. He's seeing a lot in this scene, and not all of it is obvious to you, maybe the reader. And hey, if one of those plants or animals looks really cool, then you do have the Latin name. You can look it up and you can find out way more than we could ever fit into the book about that thing. The multiple Wilsons was actually something that I had to sell pretty hard with first Rebecca and then Ed, because neither of them were convinced that this was A, a good idea, and B, would work, even if it was a good idea. So I'm not sure they were even convinced by the time they'd approved the script, which had, like you said, young Wilson, middle-aged Wilson, and what we called present-day Wilson. And by about 10 pages into the written script, we would say dialogue PDW : says this for present-day Wilson. And all the others actually had longer names. But once Chris had produced some of these thumbnails and some of these pretty loose drawings and to show the three versions of Wilson, sometimes all three on a single page, interacting with each other, I think they got it. And I think they enjoyed it. And I think the idea that prompted this in the back of my mind was that a memoir is not just telling other people about your life. It's talking to yourself about your life as well. It's a very personal type of book. It feels even more personal than, say, an autobiography. Just memoir seems like a more intimate sort of thing, maybe just because it's French and it's shorter and sounds less academic. But being able to get that across, and because of the way Chris drew these characters interacting, I hope that notion of, I'm not just talking to you, the reader, I'm talking to myself as well. And it makes it feel more reflective, I guess. That's my hope.
Yeah, well, it worked for me once I figured it out.
I'm okay with taking a few pages to figure it out.
Yeah.
If you'd said I didn't get it until like 2/3 of the way through the book, then it was like, okay, we didn't do a good job.
Or I shouldn't be here.
No.
So another thing that you can do with a graphic novel is set mood in a couple of ways. One is by the sizing of the frames and where they are.
Yep.
3 or 4 frames per page, or a whole page frame, or 2 pages.
Yep.
And the other way, and that sets the pacing, and it also sets some anticipation for about, what's going to happen when you turn the page.
That's right.
And the other thing is the use of color. And the colors in this book are really quite amazing and very effective. So can you talk about those? First of all, when you do the framing, how do you decide what to do? And do you discuss that with the illustrator? And the colors, obviously, you're talking to the colorist. So how do these decisions get made?
So yeah, in terms of the framing and the pacing, that's a constant conversation between myself and the illustrator, Chris, in this case. And yeah, you got it exactly right there. You want to use full page images judiciously, and for important scenes, and cram things tighter in other places. Just to, again, pace the story. As far as color goes, there are some constraints, especially in a book that has, scientific, you can't just fantasize the color of this type of species of ant versus that one.
Right.
So there was, again, a lot of research done by both Chris and Hillary, who I worked with on the Feynman graphic novel a bunch of years ago, almost 10 years ago. I was grateful to get Hillary to color this. But yeah, there were some color notes. So leaving aside all the stuff that has to be accurate, then there are indeed color notes on when you want to set a mood. And we were talking about a sequence just before we got online here. And it's kind of hard to see. It might be hard to see with my mediocre lighting here in my house. But here's young Ed having something of an epiphany in church, somewhat surprising for the type of scientist he becomes. And you can see the progression from other finger up here in the what would be the upper left-hand corner as you were reading the book, down to the lower right, all used to set, this idea of the light streaming in through stained glass into a much more earthy and practical view of the world, or science, science focused. I'm not sure do you have a better word for this?
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, view of things. And we were talking about this too shortly before we got online here for me to check and see whether that was a color note or not. I'm going to make a bet and say that this was Hillary's choice to do this based on conversations with Chris on what he wanted to see here. But as you said, it's a really interesting way we can use color to set a mood and bring you from one sort of feeling, because Wilson is not shy about talking about feelings in the book.
Not at all.
And, thinking about the numinous, thinking about things that you wouldn't necessarily associate with a pretty hard-nosed scientific point of view or outlook on the world, to these other things like biophilia, which is where we close the book, this sort of like inner sense of how we should and must fit in our natural world. So the ability to use color, I don't know that I would have taken the project, actually, because I think that was one of my first questions is, do we get color for this or not? And the answer was yes, obviously. And it's like, okay, then we can do it. I mean, there are advantages to black and white. A, it's cheaper to print, but B, there are interesting things that you can do. But this book, this story really needed color for, again, not just the accuracy reasons, but for sort of to get that emotional stuff across.
Well, it's very effective. I mean,
Thank you.
When people read the book, they will be affected by that. And in fact, now that we've talked about it, I'm going to go back and look at it again.
Yeah, I mean, I'll confess, I mean, it's one of those weird things, right? I haven't done a book talk like this for this book yet. I mean, the book just came out, so maybe that's not too surprising. But I only flipped through it all in one sitting, just in the past couple of days. It's like, oh, look at what she did there. Oh, Chris, what a nice job. And yeah, so it's really nice to see things come together. Prior to that, my interaction with the book for like the past 3 or 4 years, because that's about how long it took for Chris to draw. He had other things going on in his life. Let's say 2. 3 or 4 years is when actually the project started. So let's say the last 2 years. So my only interaction was at the individual panel, maybe the individual page level, fixing problems. So I haven't actually, I haven't seen the book.
You ought to read it. It's really nice.
Thanks.
So maybe this isn't fair, but do you have any regrets? Is there anything that you would do differently now, looking back on, although you haven't read the book recently?
This will sound horrible, but no, this was a really great experience. And other than not being able to get the whole of the original book in, I mean, that's a regret, but that happens every time. Every time you write anything, you can't fit it all in. So you're going to cut little pieces of your heart off over and over again and leave it on the floor. And there are some, as you mentioned before, he's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and I don't think that the first one might have been a mistake, but you don't get 2 mistakes like that from the committee. He's a really good writer. So there were things that we just couldn't fit in. But like we were saying,
yeah,
the book's
the book
still
is
there. You can have both.
There are stories in the book, the original book, that wouldn't really fit in a graphic novel. There's stories about other people and their trials and tribulations that just aren't relevant at the time, even though some of the stories are really good stories, like Phil Darlington getting attacked by a crocodile. I mean,
thank you. There it is. There it is. That's the one. Because now that you say that, I remember writing in the script. I think we maybe show some scars on his arms, just in the depiction. And it's like, but we cannot digress for 6 pages for this other guy's horrible experience in a swamp. But it's a great story.
It's a great story that I actually didn't know about until I read the book.
Really? Because you knew him too.
Well, I never met Phil Darling. He knew he was gone before I got there. And
oh, really? Okay.
yeah, he was a scientific rival. I didn't agree with much of what he did. Okay. Well, he did biogeography before plate tectonics. So there were a lot of acrobatics that one had to do in those days to explain the similarities between Africa and South America, and they didn't work out in the long term.
Yeah, so the physics analogy is like, we keep looking for the ether, and we're going to keep making the ether weirder and weirder so that our wrong theories work. So
or it's dark matter. Maybe they'll just call that ether. I don't know.
I don't know.
You mentioned about how prolific Ed, I guess, still is.
Yeah.
I a few years ago, he got an honorary degree from U of M, and I was his local host, and so I spent
remember you telling me about this. Yeah.
The whole day with him. It was a really nice day, and we were sitting in Espresso Royale and talking about his productivity. I said, "And how do you write so many books?" I have what we would call it white page typewriter syndrome. Now it's white screen syndrome, where you just sit there and nothing happens. And he said he never stops writing. He writes all the time. He carries a pad with him and a pen, and never stops writing. So he never faces a blank page. It's always something there. And that's something
that I've heard people suggest. There's set a writing goal, X number of words per day. But I think one of the better, and that can work for some people and can work for others. But to your point here, one of the things that seemed to make sense, and I just don't have the guts to do it, is like, stop in the middle of a sentence.
Ooh.
Stop writing for the day in the middle of a sentence, and that way you'll have something to pick up on the next day. It's like, I'll forget how it ends. Like, I don't know what the verb should be.
Well, the trick there is to actually have the first half of a sentence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to get to that one.
So one other thing I think worth talking about very quickly, Literati, is that one of the things I learned when Ed was here was that he stopped traveling. It was a special thing for him to actually come here, because he stayed home to nurse his wife, who has dementia. Another view into his personality and the kind of person that he is.
Yeah.
So
I was told that when we started. It's like he'll do stuff that can be done by phone, but he doesn't leave now.
We do have some audience questions that I think we can ask in our remaining 10 or so minutes. And the first one, I'm interested in Jim's view on presenting scientific content alongside a biography of the scientist. It seems to be a pattern in his work. What benefit does the science content gain from the reader learning about the scientist, and how is the biographical story enriched by the scientific content?
That's an excellent question. And I don't know if I get the balance right. And I'm struggling with that right now with a book that I'm trying to finish. It's actually already been penciled, but we're having troubles with some of the science bits. And is it too long? Is it too short? Is it enough? Is it not enough? The really fundamental answer, though, gets back to the thing that Bill and I were talking about earlier. And that's, you often, let's take Hawking, for example. Everybody knows Stephen Hawking because he's got the computer voice, he's got the really tricked out wheelchair, and he's got a really sharp sense of humor. That's probably a gentle way to say it. But he's fundamentally different, and apologies to their fans, but he's fundamentally different than a Kardashian. There's a reason this guy is famous. He has done things. There's a reason Jane Goodall is famous beyond the fact that she's telegenic and a wonderful public speaker. These people have done things that have changed the way we live in the world. Maybe not so much Hawking. We don't interact with black holes very often, but certainly Jane Goodall, certainly E.O. Wilson. And to just focus on their lives and not talk about the things that they do, which is integral to who they are, would seem like you were not getting the whole story. It's important to know, and I think the best scientists, the Wilsons, the Goodalls, are able to communicate what they did, why they did it, and why you should care effectively. And so putting all those things together, I think gives you a better picture of who they are as a person. And that's really what we want. And you can't give it all. Bill, I don't know how many, if we were to do your biography or a memoir and graphic novel, we couldn't touch on the many hundreds of scientific papers that you've written on various things. There's just no way to get there. But you'd have to do something.
They're not hundreds, but there would be a lot of fish.
Well, there's dozens at least, right?
Yeah, fish.
So you can't get that all in there.
Sadly.
But you can't not do it either, because that's who they are. And to my mind, science is the scientific method, and doing science is one of the greatest creations that we've done as a species. And we wouldn't, it's a cliche to say it, but none of us would be talking to each other right now without lots and lots of sciencing happening over the past 100 years. It's important, and some of it is literally accessible and fun to learn about. And so that's what I hope to do. Like I said, getting the balance right is tough, and I don't feel like I've always done that well. Fortunately for Naturalist, again, I was told don't go outside the book. So these are the science bits that you need to include. So that made life easy. And he is an excellent writer and an excellent explainer of what he did and why. So that made it fun.
I'm going to go out of order here. The next question, Jim, who are your biggest inspirations in terms of both graphic narrative and science?
I want to punt on the graphic narrative because there's too many. Actually, this is not the shelf of graphic novels. I would have to go to another room. I would say science-wise, it changes over the years, but there's one constant. And my friend Steve Lieber made this bust of Niels Bohr for when he was doing a short story about Bohr with me in the first book I did. I think he's probably he stays as the lodestar, both for his creativity and because he is something that I don't think I could ever even approach. Everybody seemed to love Niels Bohr. Everybody wanted to work with this guy. Even when people disagreed with him strongly about political stuff or scientific stuff, Einstein and Bohr never agreed on quantum physics. Never. They both thought the other was completely off their rocker on the topic of quantum mechanics, especially. They still loved each other in ways that are really difficult to express. So the fact that he was a great scientist, a great person, and a great mentor, I guess he's probably the number one in my scientific pantheon. As far as graphic novels go, wow, there's artists, there's writers, there's writer-artist combination. I mean, I see in your background, John, you've got a book by Chris Ware, Building Stories. He's an inspirational current creator right now, just for the formalistic stuff that he does. I can only hope to be as clever as he is with page layout. Gosh, I'm gonna cheat. Look up my bibliography and see all the artists I've worked with. It's them.
Good answer. We've got time for one more, and this is a question with some local flavor. For both of you, I hear both of you guys belong to a monthly book club that meets in Angel Hall on the campus here at the University of Michigan in non-COVID times, filled with intelligent conversation like we've just heard from both of you geniuses. Can you tell us more about that? And will that book group be discussing any of Jim's work in the future?
Bill, you want to go? I think you've been part of the group longer than me. Or did we?
I'm not sure about that.
We might have arrived at about the same time.
About the same time. It was started by Eric Rabkin, who was the professor in the English department who taught science fiction and fantasy. And yes, we've met now for many years, and it was in Angel Hall. We're now doing it via Zoom. So Eric, who has retired and moved to New Jersey, can join us, and it's always fun to see him. We've not done any of Jim's books, and there's also a graphic novel discussion group that Jim has occasionally been to. And he's always said, no, we can't discuss any of his books. So we've never done that.
I'm too chicken.
There's no reason to be a chicken, but I understand. So add whatever you want, Jim.
Yeah, there's not much more to add other than to say people who are interested are welcome to join us. Again, it's easier now than it was during non-COVID times. I hate to say this, but I hope it gets hard again. I hope we can start meeting in person sometime in the next 12 months. But yeah, I can't count the number of books that I either wouldn't have started or wouldn't have finished if not for knowing that book group was coming up in the next 3 to 4 weeks. And I want to know enough to be able to participate in the conversation and hear what other people thought and hear why, get some confirmation bias going and learn why I was right to like or not like this particular part. Or, and this happens all the time, realize, I didn't like it, but I didn't like it for the wrong reasons. Now I should go reread it because there's much more there than I thought there was. It's made me a much better reader and maybe even No, maybe. I'm sure it has in subtle ways that I can't even define. Made me a better writer as well, just by thinking about what I'm reading more carefully than I would otherwise, and getting other people's opinions and thoughts and what they bring to the book. It's really quite a lot of fun.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour. So Bill Fink, Jim Ottaviani, thank you both for joining us this evening at Home with Literati. It was a pleasure to hear you both talk about
Pleasure.
Naturalist, which people can purchase again at the link that's in the chat there. And also, if you're watching later on YouTube, you can purchase it at the link in the description below. Jim and Bill, I hope that we can have you both in the bookstore soon as well.
I'd love that.
We miss doing in-person events and hope to do them before another year passes. But until then, please continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our attendees, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at the next virtual event. Until then, take care, everybody.
Yes, thank you, John. Thank you, Bill. And thanks
Thank you.
everybody who's a little number on the bottom of the screen.
Been
Have
a
a great night
pleasure.
all. Take care.